For insulin to work, it's got to have some essential cofactors, things like chromium, carnitine, vitamin B3 and vitamin B1. We can have insulin resistance because the insulin receptor is blocked by something. This is often a toxin. There was a fire in Italy at Sfeso in the 1970s. The factory caught fire and there was a huge release of dioxins. And as a result of that, type 2 diabetes just took off. That was the first clue that chemicals cause insulin resistance. We are all poisoned without exception. So the point is, we all need to do the detox regimes. As soon as you get into ketosis, everything just starts to fall into place. And that food pyramid is completely upside down. We should be base loading with fat and meat and eggs and fish and just occasional fruit, the occasional sugar as a treat, because both so dysregulate our metabolism for a multiplicity of reasons. Now, when I started work as a GP in the 1980s, it was relatively easy to get people well with a simple elimination diets and a few supplements. Nowadays, it's much more difficult because most people are carbohydrate addicts. We're all poisoned. Underactive thyroids and poor adrenal functions and poor mitochondrial functions are very common. We just all have to do it all.
Sarah, we're currently in an epidemic right now of metabolic dysfunction, insulin resistance. A huge number of people, I think the latest I've seen is over 90% are metabolically deranged. How does somebody, other than the fact that this is encompassing most people, how does somebody know if they're part of that group?
If you are eating a diet which is high in sugars and carbohydrates and ultra-processed foods, you will be a part of that group. These foods are so pernicious and are driving so much of Western pathology. And it's really interesting to look at the history of this. Because during the 1960s and the 1970s and the early 1980s, the big health problem was cigarettes and tobacco. That's what was driving the majority of ill health. And with education, people woke up to that and cigarette smoking, tobacco smoking reduced. Now, the tobacco companies, and in this country, it was Philip Morris, and in America it's Reynolds. What they were doing to their tobacco to make it more addictive is they were adding sugar and they were adding extra nicotine. They had whole teams of scientists working on making that tobacco more addictive. Now, when they realized that sales were going to dry up because tobacco sales were falling, those companies went and bought up the food companies and then got those scientists to apply their skills to make food more addictive. So those scientists looked at what people like about food, and it's the feel in the mouth, it's the crunch factor, it's the sweetness, it's the right amount of, it's the texture, it's all those things. And they designed ultra-processed foods. And ultra-processed foods are highly addictive. Eating them is as bad as eating, sugar and highly refined carbohydrates, and that is driving our current epidemics of ill health. And I went to a public health collaboration conference recently, and the figures were for this country that children now get 75% of their calories from ultra-processed food, and teenagers get 86% of their calories from ultra-processed foods. So our foods are becoming increasingly addictive. And whilst they might satisfy the sensations in the mouth, they don't fool the gut hormones. So people eat these foods, and they've got all the right textures and taste hits, that umami, that right amount of salt, that right amount of sugar. But as I say, the gut hormones aren't fooled. And so there's no satiety there. They're not satisfying foods. And that means people cannot stop eating. So the gut says, well, that was useless. Go and have some more food. Let's try and get some proper nutrition. And so people eat and eat and eat. And this explains why obesity is such a problem, why people are constantly hungry, why they have to snack regularly through the day in order to keep their energy levels up, and so on and so forth. So the ultra-processed food is a real major problem. And we're now seeing cancer, heart disease and dementia in people younger and younger and younger. Was a case reported in the paper, national paper recently, of a young girl who was complaining that her GP didn't pick up her colon cancer. This girl was 23. You should not get colon cancer when you're 23. So So this is the problem. It's modern foods, ultra-processed foods, which are driving metabolic syndrome and all the problems that go with that.
Okay, clear on the first step here. Get rid of the ultra-processed foods. But this is, again, such a major problem. This audience here that's tuning in, most of them are going to have gotten rid of those foods long ago. What's the next step?
Okay, the next step is to do whatever you have to do in order to get into ketosis, because ketones are the evolutionary correct fuel. And the bottom line is that humans evolved because we were carnivore, not to become carnivore. So my preferred diet these days is meat heavy. That's heavy in meat, fish, eggs, butter, and then low carbohydrate green vegetables for variety, like avocado, olives, salad, crunchy things like that. And people doing that diet, they find it's not addictive. It's very satisfying. If they want to do time-restricted eating, it's easy because you are in ketosis. It's low toxicity. It doesn't lend itself to the upper fermenting gut. The bottom line is that is the evolutionary correct diet. So cut out, obviously the grains, but also many root vegetables, nuts, pulses, all those foods. They're not healthy. They're intrinsically toxic. And there's potential for them to be fermented in the gut, and that causes a whole host of other problems.
Okay, so ketosis, heavy meat diet. Is the goal to be in long-term ketosis or to dip in and out?
I think it's fine to dip in and out. And guess what? Primitive man did dip in and out. In fact, the reason that we evolved to function on two fuels was because as primitive man migrated away from the equator, migrated north and migrated south, he had to solve the problem of winter. And of course, in the winter, the hunting is not so good, the food is sparse, but we get an autumn windfall. And what is that autumn windfall? It's fruits, nuts, seeds, root vegetables, pulses, all those foods, all those carbohydrate-based foods. And the best evolutionary ploy when those foods are available is to eat them in an addictive way. So we evolved the carbohydrate addictive gene, which made us eat and eat and eat those carbohydrates and get fat. And fat is survival value for the winter. A, it's insulating, and B, it's obviously a food source. And in parallel with that, and this is what's so interesting, if you get all that free food, what you don't want to do is spend energy wastefully. Don't go out and play lots of rugby and cricket and hockey. We just don't have the food reserves to cope with that, or primitive man didn't. So another feature of a high carbohydrate diet is it makes people fatigued. So they don't want to exercise. So they're quite happy sitting around, scoffing as many apples and bananas and peaches and pears as they possibly can, getting fat, and say that's survival value for the winter. But the converse is true. When winter comes along, there are none of those carbohydrate-rich foods. We're back to hunting. And to hunt, you have to be A, clever, and B, physically energized. You have to be clever because primitive man was a persistent hunter. So me on my own, I couldn't, run down a zebra or gazelle. They just disappear into the distance and that would be that. But if we cooperated as a tribe, maybe with dogs as well to, follow a scent, then we could follow that animal and maybe take it in turns to run and run and run and run it down. And eventually that animal will come to bay, and that might be a mammoth or a bison or an antelope or whatever, and then we would kill it. And that would be food for the whole tribe that would last days or maybe weeks. So the interesting thing about being carnivore and being in ketosis is it makes you mentally clever and physically more active. And of course, those are two very desirable things. Just to illustrate that point, the samurai warriors, before any altercation, they will fast for 24 hours because their reflexes are faster, they're stronger, and they have more stamina. So we've evolved to run on two fuels, yes, sugars and carbohydrates, but that will be just for a brief window of time in the autumn. And our metabolism would change to allow for that. But most of the year we would be in ketosis. So in answer to your question, yes, I think it's fine to dip in and out of ketosis. And guess what? When I have my Christmas lunch, I shall probably eat all the wrong things. I shall thoroughly enjoy it. I shan't be in ketosis by the end of the day, but I will get back on the wagon afterwards.
As you share that hunting story, it got me thinking about eating the whole animal and organ meats. Is that something you partake in as part of your diet?
Oh, hugely, hugely. And organ meats are far more nutritious than the muscle meats. So, the tribe, primitive tribes, when they split up an animal, the headhunters would get the liver and the heart and the glands, and the women would get that rubbish muscle meat, those horrible steaks and from the back end. But there's another interesting thing about this, because as you know, thyroid problems are extremely common. And what's been my observation is that people who have an underactive thyroid, if they are eating a meat-heavy carnivore diet with lots of offal, very often their requirement for thyroid hormones decreases. And if you think about that, if you're eating the whole animal, including glands and tissues, you're also eating that animal's thyroid hormones, which are equally potent for us, for humans, as they are for animals. So, we're getting, it's not just meat and nutrition, we're getting a whole range of important hormones, probably sex hormones, if you're eating testicle, adrenal hormones, if you're eating adrenals, and thyroid hormones, as well as those that are distributed around the body. So yes, the offal is a very important component of a carnivore diet.
Okay, so our thesis today is metabolic dysfunction. Let's take a step back and talk about the physiology as somebody is heading down that path. We've already talked about the ultra-processed foods, carbohydrates, sugars. When we're abusing these, let's talk about the changes in the body over even an extended period of time.
Okay. Well, what happens when you eat sugars and carbohydrates is they are very rapidly digested in the gut. Now, the venous drainage of the gut doesn't go into the systemic circulation. The blood that comes from the gut goes into the portal vein and straight to the liver. And the liver is a sorting house. And of course, after a meal, you'll have a tsunami of sugar pouring through into the portal vein that has to be dealt with by the liver. Now, the first line of defense is glycogen. And we have in the liver what I call a glycogen sponge. I think of it as a sponge because it soaks up, it soaks up that sugar that's pouring through. We also have glycogen in our muscles, which also soaks up any excess sugar that's in the bloodstream and is a storage organ. Now, that glycogen sponge can only work if it's been squeezed dry between meals. And if it's not been squeezed dry between meals because we've been overeating or under-exercising or not using our brains, and that glycogen sponge becomes saturated, we then fall back on a second line of defense, which is insulin. And insulin will bring the blood sugar down by converting it into fat. Now, if it converts into the fat immediately in the liver, we will get fatty liver disease. And guess what? We are seeing epidemics of so-called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. But the other place that insulin, of course, dumps fat is in our own fat, in our body fat, in our subcutaneous fat. But the point here is insulin is the second line of defense. We shouldn't be relying on insulin all the time because the pancreas can exhaust and eventually insulin resistance will evolve. So that's why, and in addition to reducing our carbohydrates, time-restricted eating is very helpful because that gives a chance for our glycogen sponge to be squeezed dry, as I call it. So that's the first problem with too much sugar coming through, being consumed in a meal. We overwhelm our glycogen sponge. We start to employ insulin. And if you're doing that all the time, you end up with insulin resistance. And insulin resistance is type 2 diabetes. The second problem with having too many sugars and carbohydrates in our diet is eventually you will overwhelm the ability of the gut to remain sterile. And bacteria and yeast move in and start to ferment those foods, and we end up with a fermenting upper gut. Now, that is a problem for many reasons. The first problem is that those microbes ferment to produce toxins, like ethyl alcohol, propyl alcohol, butyl alcohol, hydrogen sulfide, D-lactate, ammonarchal compounds, and these are all toxic. They have to be, and in fact, if you allowed those products in the gut to go straight into the bloodstream, we would be unconscious very quickly. And the liver does an incredible job in dealing with those toxins. But to do that job, it requires a lot of energy, and that, energy which we'd much rather spend, doing something jolly. And B, it's very demanding of raw materials. So we're using up an awful lot of amino acids, sulfate, glutathione, and some sugars in order to detoxify those nasties. And in the business of detoxifying them, creates free radicals. So one of the reasons why you have a nasty hangover after drinking too much alcohol is all the free radicals that are generated as a result of the detoxification of alcohol. So here's a Christmas tip. If you drink too much at Christmas, and I might do, before you go to bed, take 3 or 4 grams of vitamin C, and you will wake up in the morning with a completely clear head and no hangover. So fermenting gut is a big problem. And another problem with the fermenting gut are the microbes themselves get into the bloodstream. So the fermenting gut is a leaky gut. Those microbes can get in the bloodstream. And then they get stuck at distal sites in the body. And if they get stuck in those sites, they will drive inflammation. So those microbes getting stuck in our joints drives arthritis. They get stuck in our muscles. They drive fibromyalgia and polymyalgia rheumatica. If they get stuck in our blood vessels, they can drive inflammation of the blood vessels and temporal arteritis. In the skin, urticaria or eczema. In the gut itself, inflammatory bowel disease. In the bladder, you can get irritable bladder. And some women suffer terribly with interstitial cystitis, which is nearly always allergy to yeast. It can be allergy to anything, but common is yeast. The really fascinating one is that if you've got those microbes in your gut, then there is potential for those microbes to get into the brain. Not my words, words of Nishihara, a Japanese researcher. And in the brain, those microbes can ferment out neurotransmitters like noradrenaline and adrenaline into LSD and amphetamine-like substances. And this may be the basis of psychosis. So anybody with any psychological condition, whether it's anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, manic depression, psychosis, whatever, the starting point to treat them is a carnivore diet. And certainly a ketogenic diet. And in fact, there's some fascinating research being done in Edinburgh as we speak. Dr. Rachel Brown, who's a psychiatrist there, Dr. Ian MacDonald, looking at reversing schizophrenia with a ketogenic diet. And the results are fantastic. But they're not the first to do this. Again, 2 wonderful psychiatrists, Dr. Abram Hoffer and Dr. Carl Pfeiffer, they were not managing but curing schizophrenia with a ketogenic diet, and I'm quite sure the mechanism of that comes from the upper fermenting gut. One easy way to diagnose people with an upper fermenting gut, and this derives from the work of Caroline Pond. Now, she was doing some research where she was asking the question, where do animals dump their fat when they have an excess of calories? So when they're well fed, which doesn't happen very often in the wild, of course, when they're well fed, where do they dump their fat? And she was working at Milton Keynes, cycling into work and picking up roadkill on her bicycle. And when she dissected that roadkill, what she found is that those animals dumped that fat around lymph nodes. Now, that makes good sense because obviously wild animals are going to be injured in the course of chasing a prey or running away from a predator. And it's the lymph nodes and the immune system that are responsible for healing and repair. And the business of healing and repair is hugely demanding of energy. And fat, having a local source of fat, is the ideal fuel for them to work. Now, if you've got an upper fermenting gut, which is leaky, and you're oozing bacteria and yeast into your bloodstream, then the immune system is very busy in the gut to deal with that inflammation. And that inflammation requires energy. And so fat is dumped around the midriff. And so people have a beer belly. They have a waist that's bigger than their chest. They become apple-shaped. And we know that being apple-shaped is a major risk factor for heart disease, for example, because of these fermenting microbes. So that's a very good clue. Anybody whose waist exceeds their chest or their hips almost certainly has an upper fermenting gut. I'm a bit more pear-shaped. So pear-shaped is desirable.
This fat here that's building up around the abdomen, are we talking about visceral fat around the organs?
Correct. And that visceral fat is deposited, I believe. Now, I haven't got a study that I can evidence-base this other than Caroline Pond's seminal work. But I think visceral fat is symptomatic of the upper fermenting gut. And that is driving inflammation. And we can cure that very easily. We have to, first of all, stop feeding those microbes. Now, the interesting thing in microbes is they can't ferment fat. So a high-fat diet, low carb, and normal protein is a great start because that starves little wretches. And then we want to kill them. And we can kill them with vitamin C, 5 grams, and with iodine, Lugol's iodine, 15%, 3 drops. I like those things to be taken separately because vitamin C is a reducing agent, iodine is an oxidizing agent. They knock each other out. So I suggest people take iodine in the morning, vitamin C at night, or the other way around, whichever you prefer. Although some people comment that iodine disrupts their sleep. So I tend to take iodine in the morning. So that's a great start. And the other tool, which I'm finding very helpful, and I've learned much from the work of Dr. G.I. Janelle, is MSM, methyl sulfonyl methane. Now, it's very cheap. I'm always looking for cheap tools that we can all afford and introduce safely into our regimes. But we are all sulfur deficient. Not my words, but the words of Stephanie Seneff, brilliant biochemist that I'm sure you know her. And she maintains, we're all sulfur deficient. But if you take sulfur in the upper gut, which is an aerobic environment, then it kills these microbes. But in the anaerobic lower bowel, the microbiome, which should be teeming with microbes, in that anaerobic environment, it acts as a prebiotic and it feeds those microbes. So it's a double whammy. So MSM is an additionally helpful way to sort out the upper fermenting gut. Once you're ahead of the game, then we don't need to take all those things all the time. But as I say, I'm quite sure primitive man was in and out of upper fermenting gut. When the carbohydrates were abundant, he was fermenting, and when they were not abundant, then he was not. And in fact, we have a very, very good clue that he had an upper fermenting gut, because we have evolved liver enzymes specifically to deal with the products of the upper fermenting gut. The one we all know about is gamma GT. Now, gamma GT is specific for ethyl alcohol. That's the commonest fermenting product, because what are we going to eat in the autumn? We're going to eat fruit. And what is fruit? It's a bag of sugar with a skin around it, which is covered with yeast. That's how we make wine. That's how we make cider. So if you eat those foods in abundance, you are eating the two ingredients that's going to ferment very quickly. And you will produce ethyl alcohol. But gamma GT is very good at detoxifying ethyl alcohol. So if you go to your doctor and you have a high gamma GT, you'll say, oh, you're drinking too much alcohol, are you? But I have seen teetotalers with a high gamma GT. Why? They're fermenting sugars with yeast. And so I like to see the gamma GT, the AST, and the ALT. These are the 3 liver enzymes that deal with the upper fermenting gut. I like to see those all below 20. But of course, reference ranges are often much higher than that, because reference ranges are taken from the so-called normal population. But the normal population should be people eating a carnivore diet. And I can tell you, my carnivores, their gamma GTs, AST, and ALTs are way below 20.
Okay, so upper fermenting gut, you've told us 3 different supplements that can help eradicate that. The ketogenic diet is also part of that protocol.
Correct.
The good news in all of this, whether it be the upper fermenting gut or insulin resistance, is the upstream treatment is the same. Getting rid of the ultra-processed foods, bringing the sugars down, bringing the carbs down, and then again, those 3 supplements, if we have an upper fermenting gut, to at least temporarily tame that down.
Correct. And then
But it gets very complicated and expansive throughout the body, especially with the upper fermenting gut and different symptoms we can have. But again, the good news is treatment is relatively simple.
correct. Well, it's intellectually simple. It's practically very difficult for people because, of course, sugars and carbohydrates are so addictive. And I'm an addict. I can absolutely sympathize with that. In fact, I have an addiction test for foods. And my addiction test is if I can have one of those foods and not finish the packet, then that's okay to have in the house. But I wouldn't dare have a bag of cashew nuts in the house, because if I had one cashew nut, guess what? The whole bag would disappear. I daren't have a bar of chocolate in the house, because if I had one square of chocolate, the whole bar would disappear. So that's my personal addiction test, which helps guide me as to what's safe to eat and what isn't safe to eat. But the third thing we have to do then is we have to think about insulin resistance. And insulin will come into play, on Christmas Day when I eat all the wrong things, then of course I'm going to spike insulin. And for insulin to work, it's got to have some essential cofactors, things like chromium, carnitine, vitamin B3 and vitamin B1. Those are the important micronutrients for insulin to be effective. And then insulin can be, we can have insulin resistance because the insulin receptor is blocked by something. Now, this is often a toxin. And the best example of this was there was a fire in Italy at Sfeso in the 1970s. I think it was about 75, I think, when the factory caught fire and there was a huge release of dioxins. Now, dioxins are extremely nasty, toxic chemicals. And as a result of that, type 2 diabetes just took off in the area immediately surrounding Sfeso. So that was the first clue that chemicals cause insulin resistance. And we know the studies have not been done as to tell us which chemicals are critical, but it's going to be heavy metals and it's going to be volatile organic compounds and pesticides. But these days, I don't do the tests to look for the chemical. Why? Because we're all poisoned. I used to do a lot of fat biopsies looking for pesticides and volatile organic compounds. I never saw a normal result. When I do chelation tests to look for heavy metals in urine with the chelation agent, and I use DMSA, I've never seen a normal result. We are all poisoned without exception. So my advice is, the point is, we all need to do the detox regimes. So don't spend lots of money on expensive tests. Just get on and do the detox regimes. And this is a hot subject of a whole other lecture. But briefly, any heating regime will allow us to boil off, as I call it, not sweat out, boil off volatile organic compounds and pesticides that are dumped in our fat. You see, the liver can cope with some of those chemicals, but if they get past the liver, maybe because we've inhaled them or maybe because they've come through our skin, they get stuck in our fat. So the liver enzymes can't get at them. So we have to mobilize them. And this is predicated on some wonderful work by an American surgeon called Bill Ray. And he was working in the 60s and the 70s as a cardiothoracic surgeon. And in those days, the anesthetic gases were not scavenged. So essentially, he was poisoned by anesthetic gases from the operating theatre. And when you get poisoned by a chemical, that's often followed by allergy to that chemical. So he developed multiple chemical sensitivity. He was unable to work. So he got interested in ecological medicine and set up the Dallas Environmental Center in Texas, where he asked, how can we detoxify? How can we get rid of these chemicals? And at that time, he was doing blood tests to measure chemicals to see what was in the blood. And he accumulated 210 patients that he put through detox regimes. And these regimes were heating regimes, massage, and then showering off. And the idea here is we are heating up the chemicals in our subcutaneous fat, boiling them off onto the lipid layer of the surface of the skin, and then washing them off in a shower. And what he demonstrated, the first interesting observation he made is that 200 of those patients initially got worse. Why? Because we're mobilizing chemicals from the fat into the bloodstream and they're getting acute poisoning effectively. But when he continues their regimes, A, these people improve clinically, and B, he demonstrated through testing that they reduce their total toxic load. I've collected about 30 patients that I've done fat biopsies before and after such regimes, and in every single case, the toxic load is reduced. So as I'm saying, don't spend money on expensive tests, just do the regimes. And I don't think it matters what heating regime is used. Sauning is wonderful if you've got the time, but if not, bathing, Epsom salt baths works really well. The key is to wash off the chemicals afterwards. And what would enhance this is to use a detox cream. Now, I've made up one, which is a mixture of coconut oil, shea butter, vitamin C and vitamin D. But you don't have to have that. Any oil will do. Any organic oil will do. And so if you put just organic coconut oil on your skin, then that will soak into the skin. It'll soak into the dead cells on the surface of the skin. And guess what? We cast off about 3.5 kilograms of dead cells every year. So as you shed off those dead cells, that nice organic, clean organic olive coconut oil will mop up chemicals that have been mobilized from the subcutaneous, and that will enhance the detox. So my view is we all need to do that. And then heavy metals, again, don't spend money on the tests, just do the heavy metal chelation. And we talked about MSM earlier. And as we speak, I'm doing a study looking at levels of heavy metals in urine using MSM. And it's very clear it's a very useful chelating agent. Now, it doesn't do all the heavy metals. It's not brilliant for lead and mercury, but it does pull some out. What it is brilliant for, and I'm so excited about this, it's brilliant for aluminium. I see very high levels of aluminium come out. And you may be aware of the work of Dr. Chris Exley, who's based up in the northeast here. His nickname is Mr. Aluminium. There's nothing he doesn't know about aluminium. And he maintains that we are all poisoned by aluminium. And of course, aluminium, is the main adjuvant that's used in immunizations. He maintains that the only way you can get rid of it is with silica water, which, yes, that may well be right, but it's very expensive. And, my patients can't afford to drink silica water every day, but they can afford MSM. Again, I had another patient who did this, who spiked very high levels of bismuth, which is a nasty toxic heavy metal. So I said, Frank, how on earth where did that come from? Oh, he said, about 20 years ago, he used a preparation called Denol or Pepto-Bismol to treat stomach ulcers. It might be effective, but in taking that, you're going to poison yourself with bismuth. So again, MSM will pull out the bismuth. And recently, of course, one of the favorite radio contrast dyes used is gadolinium, which is a very toxic heavy metal. It's often used to diagnose myocarditis or as an enhancement for MRI scans, but MSM pulls that out beautifully well. So anybody who needs such a scan should take MSM before, during and after to make sure the gadolinium does its job for the purpose of the scan and is then pulled out of the body. So MSM is going to be a very useful tool. And when I've gathered sufficient data, we can then publish to see exactly which metals are pulled out most effectively. DMSA is very good for lead and mercury. So I think I shall probably end up with a hybrid regime of DMSA, 15 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, taken every week, once a week for maybe 3 months. And then MSM, 10 grams a day, every day for, say, 3 months. And that will do a pretty good job for the majority of people to strip out their heavy metals. Now, one word warning about MSM. It is so effective that you can get quite severe detox reactions with it. So always start with a tiny dose. Always start with just 1/4 teaspoon a day and then build up slowly to 3 teaspoons a day. Do that for 3 months and then maybe in the longer term, a maintenance dose of 1/2 teaspoon a day. So that's going to tackle the insulin resistance side of things. And with all that in place, that's going to go a long way. But having done all that, it's always lovely to test to make sure that you have arrived. And probably the easiest test for people to do is 2 weeks of continuous glucose monitoring. You can buy the kits on Amazon. I use the Abbott Freestyle Libra, and they give you they're painless to use. Read the result on a smartphone, and that will tell you exactly what's happening over 2 weeks. And it tells us two very useful things. The first thing is we are all a little bit different. Some people get away with some foods, but not others. And if you are allergic to a food, interestingly, that can manifest with a blood sugar spike. So I had one person who got massive blood sugar spikes, when they had their allergic food, but not because it was a high carbohydrate food, but just because they were getting allergic reaction to it, probably mediated by stress hormones. And the other thing that's useful is if you do spike your blood sugar, you can then see how long it takes to come back down again. So now it just so happened I did a riding holiday in Sicily a couple of years ago, very dear friend of mine, and she had a continuous glucose monitor. So I thought, this is going to be interesting. So we were pretty well behaved, for the first few days, but having a glass of wine, no problem. It stayed very strictly between 4 and 6. Now, riding holidays in Sicily, 8 hours on a horse every day, in the middle of nowhere for lunch. What was the typical Sicilian picnic? A large hunk of bread and a little bit of salami. So of course I fed the bread to the horse and ate the salami, but Charlotte, she ate the bread. And she's not diabetic. Her blood sugar shot up to 11. I was blown away by that. And that's just from white bread, which, maybe there's some sugar in it, but it illustrates how rapidly starches can be broken down to sugars. But the good thing is her blood sugar fell immediately after. And therefore she didn't have insulin resistance. Her insulin obviously spiked, brought the blood sugar down very quickly, and all was well. But if you had insulin resistance, then the blood sugar would spike up and it would stay high and it would take a long time to come back down again. So that's a very good clue. We can all do this at home and diagnose insulin resistance and which foods are definitely safe to eat. But do put all these interventions in place first. Because if I know what the result's going to be. If someone's eating high carbohydrate diet, their sugar's going to be all over the place. But do all these interventions first, and then continuous glucose monitor, and that will tell you if you've arrived.
When it comes to testing, this is something I wanted to get into. You mentioned the CGM and then looking at the spike and how quickly it comes down. That's a great tip. How do you feel about fasting insulin, or something like a Kraft test where you're actually pushing glucose in the body and then over a period of time seeing the reaction?
Well, those are also very useful tests. And fasting insulin should be very low. And in fact, an insulin tolerance test is probably a better test than the glucose tolerance test. But it's not done in this country, and measuring insulin is expensive. So we can infer what insulin is doing by measuring sugar, which is very cheap. One little tip, just to which can confuse the results, is that vitamin C is a very similar molecule to sugar. In fact, animals can make, it's only humans, fruit bats and guinea pigs that can't make their own vitamin C, but all other animals can make their own vitamin C from sugar. It illustrates the point they're very similar molecules. And if you are taking high dose of vitamin C and the test that you're using involves glucose oxidase, then you might get a higher result than expected. In fact, I shocked myself one day because I just tested my glucose out and it was 7. I was absolutely horrified, but I just mega dosed with vitamin C because I'd had a bit of a cold. So the vitamin C will increase, it will give you a false high of glucose. So just bear that in mind if you're using the glucose oxidase strips for testing blood sugar.
For somebody that hasn't adopted the diet we've been talking about today, they're spiking blood glucose. Let's talk about the reaction on a micro level in the body when that happens. And then insulin is going to follow that, and it causes problems independently.
Correct. So if you spike your blood sugar and you overwhelm your glycogen sponge, then yes, you will spike insulin. And insulin then brings the blood sugar down. And what's interesting about insulin is what insulin responds to is not the total amount of carbohydrate that you consumed, but the rate of change. So if your blood sugar goes up very quickly, then you will get a large spike of insulin. Whereas conversely, if your blood sugar rises very slowly, then you will get a much lesser spike of insulin. And so when you spike insulin, that brings the blood sugar down. And as the blood sugar starts to fall, if it falls rapidly, then the brain will move into panic mode. And the panic hormone is adrenaline, and what adrenaline will do is stimulate more sugar release from glycogen in the liver. So you end up, but if you're spiking adrenaline, that's what drives high blood pressure. And the other problem with a glucose spike is that makes for sticky blood, and those are the two major mechanisms by which arteries are damaged. Sticky sugar in the bloodstream is sticky. It sticks to the lining of blood vessels. It sticks to red cells and makes them sticky, and that damages the arteries, which then have to be healed and repaired. And cholesterol is involved in the healing and repairing process. Cholesterol does not damage our arteries. Cholesterol is part of the healing and repairing. It's an innocent bystander. And then, of course, pressure. So if you increase the pressure, if you double the pressure, let's say a hypothetical situation, if you double the blood pressure, you increase the turbulence 16-fold. And it's turbulence that damages the delicate lining of blood vessels. So that's why blood pressure is so bad for us, because again, they have to be healed and repaired, and the healing and repairing involves scar tissue, and that scar tissue is called atherosclerosis, and that narrows the blood vessels and impairs the blood supply, and that takes years to evolve. So, and again, if you're spiking insulin and then you're spiking adrenaline, then your blood sugar then falls. And then you're craving sugar and carbohydrates again. So it's very easy to spot the carbohydrate addict, as you know, because they're constantly hungry, they're constantly snacking, they're never satisfied, they've got poor levels of energy, overweight, fermenting gut, etc.
Okay, so you've talked about these glycogen sponges, which are like buffers in the body, which are used before insulin comes in. Let's make sure we're really clear on how those work, and then practically how we make sure we're depleting them on a regular basis.
Okay. One other little tip, which I forgot to mention, is one of the problems of fructose, fruit sugar, and also is the sugar that's derived from corn syrup, is that inhibits the enzyme that allows us to mobilize glycogen. So fruit is more likely to make us a sugar addict than anything else, because if the blood sugar drops, then the body can't correct, and so we get hungry and low blood sugar even faster for consuming fruit. Well, I've forgotten what your question was. So what's the question again?
Well, let's stick on this, and then we can move into that. Talking about the difference between fruit, which contains fructose, and before you describe fruit as little bags of sugar.
Yep.
Versus somebody using white sugar, because we have our 5 a day fruit as the part of the base of the pyramid, something we want to be including on a regular basis. It's given not just a free pass, but promoted as something we want to include on a regular basis, and quite a bit of it. So how do you look at the difference there between sugar and then a high sugar fruit?
Well, neither are desirable. And that food pyramid is completely upside down. We should be base loading with fat and meat and eggs and fish, and then maybe some green vegetables and just occasional fruit, the occasional sugar as a treat, because both so dysregulate our metabolism for a multiplicity of reasons that we should only be consuming them on an occasional basis. We can cope with them in the short term for short bursts of time, but we should not be consuming it on a regular basis. And the government's advice of the 5 a day of fruit and vegetables is risible. It's laughable. It has no basis in physiology or biochemistry. And I think even Robert Kennedy is saying just this, that the food pyramid is upside down. So yes, those foods, if we're starving and there's nothing else to eat, okay, but it's not the best nutrition.
And another thing we can tie into that as well are these quote unquote healthy sweeteners like honey, maple syrup. Those, again, even in the paleo world, are often given a free pass, and they don't fit within the paradigm we've been talking about, where we want to bring the carbs down, get into ketosis, bring those in.
Correct. Those, okay, for the occasional binge, fine, but not on a regular basis. And in fact, honey is full of fructose, so that's as bad as eating fruit. And artificial sweeteners, the body's intelligent. And if you taste something sweet in the mouth, the body will release hormones in anticipation of a sugar spike. I mean, looking at some of the basic figures, it astonishes me how little sugar we have in the bloodstream. So the bloodstream is comprised of about 5 liters of blood. And to have a normal blood sugar, you just need 1 teaspoon, 5 grams of sugar. So 1 gram in a litre, it's a tiny amount. So, if you've not got an effective way of mopping up that sugar from the gut, you don't need much sugar or honey to spike your blood sugar very quickly. So, and I say artificial sweeteners are similarly toxic because they generate the same hormonal response as sugar. So they really should just be avoided. They're not evolutionarily correct foods. And we can cope perfectly well with low blood sugars. I'll just give you an example of this. There were 2 intrepid explorers who decided, Ranulph Fiennes and Mike Stroud, who decided to walk across Antarctica via the South Pole unaided. And what that meant is they had to carry with them or tow with them all the supplies they needed. Now, of course, the most energy dense food is fat. So they went with lots of butter and coconut oil and fatty foods in order to power them as they went. But Mike Stroud, so they were in permanent ketosis throughout. They lost 25, they didn't quite make it. They both lost 25 kilos in weight. It was obviously a massively stressful event. But Mike Stroud was a doctor, a GP, and he was doing bloods regularly to see what was happening. And their blood sugars, now a normal blood sugar should run between about 4 and 6 millimoles per litre, were often below 1 millimole per litre. But they had no symptoms of hypoglycemia. Why? Because they were in ketosis. They were functioning very well on ketones, and that powered them through that exercise. So we can run very low blood sugars and function perfectly well, and that's what we should really be aiming for.
You brought up artificial sweeteners. I'm assuming in that context you're referring to things like aspartame. But how do you feel about ones that are in the natural world, things like stevia, monk fruit?
It's that the same principles apply. The body is intelligent, and if it tastes something sweet in the mouth, it will anticipate a sugar rush and start producing insulin, in response to that. So, and the other point is that it keeps the addictive craving for sugars going. So for the occasional treat, that's fine. But if you're using them all the time, then it switches on that sugar craving, and that's not good either, because we then can't get sugar out of our minds. And I know this from myself. I know I'm an addict, and if I have one bit of sugar, then I think wouldn't mind a bit more. Wouldn't mind a bit more. But if I have none, I forget about it. And I'm sure the rest of the world is as addicted has as addictive a tendency as I do.
I think it's just normal, yeah. Let's come back to the glycogen sponges. That's where I was trying to take it before. So what I want to get into there, we have our 2 glycogen sponges, the liver and the muscles. What does it look like using those in a healthy way, depleting them, and then allowing them to be there as a buffer?
I think that's totally acceptable. And that's what we should be doing most of the time. I mean, the glycogen sponge can hold about 1,700 calories of sugars. So, you've got to have, if your glycogen sponge is truly squeezed dry, then it can mop up a lot of sugar before it starts spilling over into the bloodstream. And we know this from the marathon runners. Marathon runners, many of them run on carbohydrates, and they carb load before a competition. But if they don't top up with sugars, so they're running along and they're constantly being fed tubes and jelly babies and goodness knows what, then they hit a wall at about 17 miles when they've exhausted their glycogen sponges. They don't have the metabolic flexibility to move into ketosis, and they just run out of energy. They just stop. But by contrast, the keto-adapted athletes, we all carry, even those ultra slim, super fit athletes, they still have quite a load of fat in the body, and that works the perfect fuel. So Mike Morton, who's a keto-adapted athlete, he holds the world record for the furthest distance run in 24 hours. He didn't need to eat, but he ran 172 miles in 24 hours. Yes, he had to have some water and some electrolytes, but he didn't need to eat. Why? Because he's running perfectly well on ketones. And again, that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Let's go back to, primitive man. If he was hunting down his prey and he was a persistent hunter, it was no good if he ran out of fuel after a few miles, because the animal would just run off and that would be the end of his hunt. But running on ketones, he could run and run and run and run and therefore be a successful hunter. So ketones are so important. But if the glycogen sponge is well squeezed dry because you're well into ketosis and you're not eating all the time, so you're not topping up constantly, then you can cope with quite a bit of carbohydrate without spiking your blood sugar. So I love potatoes. And the way I do potatoes is I cook them in the day and let them go cold. And that turns much of the starch to resistant starch. And then I fry them in lots of fat. And, what I know is I just need 2 or 3 of those and I feel very satisfied. So I know I'm not addicted to it. I know I'm not getting a carbohydrate hit from that. And it's partly because of the resistant starch, partly because they're fried in fat, and partly because I'm eating it with, meat and maybe some green vegetables. And, when I wear a monitor, it doesn't spike my glucose. So we're all a little bit different. And that's why the monitor is so helpful, because it tells you exactly what you can and can't get away with. So what I like people to do is to get on the regime as best as they can, and then test to make sure that it's sufficient, that if they know what they can get away with without spiking sugar, and if they do, make sure that it comes down quickly, and therefore you can do this yourself. You can manage it yourself, perfectly, efficiently, and well.
Earlier, when you were talking about insulin resistance, you went over a bunch of different nutrients that can help support that.
Yeah.
Is that something we can get through diet alone, or are these supplements we need to take additionally? Secondarily, is that just as we're trying to reverse it, or are those good for maintaining our metabolic health as well?
Well, a bit of each. The bottom line is, because since the advent of chemical farming, there has been, which is post Second World War, there has been a one-way movement of nutrients from the soil into plants, into animals, into us, and we throw them away. So we are all deficient in vitamins and minerals and essential fatty acids, and certainly vitamin D, vitamin C, and iodine. So there's a basic package of supplements that I like everybody to take. A good multivitamin that's got all range of B vitamins, a good multi-mineral, which has got a range of magnesium, zinc, copper, selenium, chromium, blah, blah, blah. And that will do it for most. But some people with insulin resistance need a window of time, maybe 3 months of much higher doses of, in order to correct a deficiency. The commonest one is vitamin B1, thiamine. Anybody who drinks any amount of alcohol will be thiamine deficient. And I think we can infer from that, if you've got an upper fermenting gut, the commonest thing that you're going to ferment to is alcohol, which the liver has to deal with, and that will induce a thiamine deficiency. And there's a lovely paper by, I think it's Stuart Lindsay, called in the Orthomolecular Medicine, Journal of Orthomolecular Medicine. He completely reverses type 2 diabetes simply by taking benphthiamine 1 gram daily. And he probably and that improves his type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes. And in parallel with that, a very common problem with, or a common complication of type 2 diabetes is numbness. You knock off your little nerves and you get maybe numb feet and numb hands. Benfotiamine thiamine is often very good at reversing that. So if anybody's got established diabetes and they're starting to get neuropathy, then benfotiamine 1 gram a day would be a very good way to help reverse that. We all know that chromium is essential for insulin sensitivity. And that's a very cheap and easy supplement to take, maybe 500 micrograms a day would be a good start. L-carnitine, again, acetyl L-carnitine, but of course that's abundant in meat. If you're eating meat and you've got a non-fermenting upper gut, then your carnitine levels should be absolutely fine. But that would be a particular problem for anybody who is vegetarian. As you know, I worked very closely with a wonderful biochemist, Dr. John McLaren Howard, looking at mitochondrial function in people with fatigue syndromes. And in parallel with that, we're also measuring carnitine levels routinely in people with fatigues. And I did 1,036 of these mitochondrial function tests where we were measuring carnitine. And when I went back through the results, the two interesting things stood out. The first was a third of those people on whom we did tests were vegetarian or vegan. That's much higher than the background population. And the vegetarians and the vegans were almost invariably deficient in acetyl L-carnitine. And so they are going to be much more at risk of insulin resistance than people eating a meat diet. Because if you're eating a meat diet, guess what meat's comprised of? It's comprised of mitochondria. And, mitochondria in animals are going to be full of coenzyme Q10, magnesium, acetyl L-carnitine, vitamin B3, all the things that our mitochondria need. It's not difficult to work that out, is it? So vegetarians will necessarily be deficient relative to carnivores in those essential micronutrients. And we know that mitochondria are also implicated in insulin resistance and diabetes.
Sticking with this plant-based vegan vegetarian theme, in your mind, is there a way to be on that diet long-term and still be healthy with certain supplements or certain protocols?
I don't know. But you'd have to work very hard at it. It's difficult to be low carb if you're vegetarian and vegan. Fiber, and again, much is spoken about the benefits of fiber, but I'm less than convinced. And there have been some fascinating studies looking at the microbiome of carnivores, and it is just as healthy, if not more so, than people on an omnivorous or vegetarian diet. Now, I have to say I worried about fibre and the microbiome because, we were all brought up on Burkitt and his ideas from Africa. And, my explanation was that because we don't know much about the microbiome, but what we do know is the more diverse it is, the healthier you are. And so it seems logical that if you're eating a diverse diet, then you'll get a diverse microbiome. But I was fascinated by a comment by Nick Lane, Professor Nick Lane, who's written many books on mitochondrial function, where he points out that meat fiber is the preferred prebiotic for the most abundant microbes in the gut, Bacteroides and Firmicutes. And he points out that bacteria are usually predicated on a particular nutrient, like, say, meat fiber, which will be collagen and the rest. And then they will produce a waste product that other bacteria will then ferment, maybe sulfate. And it's a little bit like that rhyme, big fleas have little fleas on their backs to bite them. Little fleas have lesser fleas, and so ad infinitum. So the point here is if you've got a good supply of meat fibre at the top end of the bacterial food chain, that then goes down through many levels of bacteria who all consume the waste products of others, and that explains the microbial diversity in the microbiome. And the next problem that I worried about was constipation, people on a carnivore diet. And as the carnivores point out, if you're constipated, then, eating more fibre is like adding more cars to a traffic jam. It doesn't necessarily work. So that made me really think about constipation. And I think constipation is a friction issue. I think constipation occurs when there is friction between the gut contents and the lining of the gut wall. And what is essential throughout the body, not just the lining of the gut, to reduce the friction within the system is exclusion zone water. And this is the work of Gerald Pollack. And kind of very, very long story short, what he's demonstrated is that water against a surface, and that can be any surface in the body, a mitochondrial membrane, the lining of the gut, lining of the lungs, or whatever, forms itself into a honeycomb-like structure. It layers up, and the result of that is it becomes negatively charged. Now, if two surfaces are negatively charged, then they repel each other like a magnet. It's a little bit like the railway system in China, maglev it's called, where the trains sit on a single railway that's that shape in cross section, and the two surfaces are powerfully negatively charged, so there's no contact there. And so the train moves in a frictionless way, and it can achieve speeds of up to 600 kilometres an hour. In a vacuum, they reckon it'll go to 1,000 kilometres an hour. That's faster than a jet plane. And so it is within the gut. And if you've got a frictionless lining of the gut, then the gut contents will slide through effortlessly. Now, the one thing, and this is work done by Stephanie Seneff and Gerald Pollack, that massively improves the quality of exclusion zone water are sulfur groups. And of course, they are supplied in abundance with MSM. And of course, meat is rich in sulfur. And if you talk to a confirmed carnivore, constipation is not an issue. Okay, they might not produce a daily turd, but it might be 3 or 4 times a week. But when they do, it's passed effortlessly. And so again, that absolutely gets the thumbs up. So we don't have to have high fibre diets in order to prevent constipation. We don't have to have high fibre diets in order to deal with the microbiome. So back to our vegetarians and vegans, it is theoretically possible to be vegetarian or vegan and keto, but you have to work hard with lots of supplements, particularly vitamin B12. And you have to eat a lot of fat, particularly coconut oil and palm oil. They're the 2 main saturated fats that you can get in a vegetarian and vegan diet. And should you use oils, then they've got to be, the only one that's really safe is olive oil, cold pressed olive oil. And be sure of your sources, because many olive oils that profess to be cold pressed actually are not. And it's difficult to get the essential oils downstream, the DHA and arachidonic acid, which is so important for our brain. You can get some from krill oil. So it is theoretically possible, but you have to work very hard at it.
Let's come back to the easy water piece. You highlighted there the importance of sulfur to maintain that. What are other things you like to do to make sure the easy water in your body is staying healthy?
Okay, well, you can't drink exclusion zone water. It's not something you can take as a supplement because it's a local factor. It's what water does against any hydrophobic or hydrophilic surface. And for good quality exclusion zone water, then you have to have some good fats in your diet. And the most important one that people forget about are the saturated fats. You need obviously good quality water, and you need heat or warmth. The reason that we run at 37 degrees centigrade is because that is the perfect temperature for the best quality exclusion zone water. So we know there are some animals, poikilotherms, snakes and reptiles, their body temperature can reduce right down to 30 or 31 degrees, whatever, and they can stay alive, but they can't function. And they have to sunbathe, they have to be warmed up, and once they're warm they can move like lightning, of course. So good quality exclusion zone water is absolutely essential for not just for movement within the body, but also to reduce the biochemical friction in the body. So exclusion zone water provides structure. Now mitochondria are obviously there to generate energy. And it's not just a case of having the raw materials. They've all got to be in just the right 3-dimensional space. In fact, the business of generating energy is all about handling electrons and protons. And for those respiratory enzymes, which are easily remembered by complex 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5, for those respiratory enzymes to be effective, they have to be in a very precise three-dimensional space. They have to be within an angstrom of each other. That's the width of an atom. And having good quality exclusion zone water allows that to happen. As soon as you cool down and get too cold, then that structure is lost. It's diminished. There's more biochemical friction in the system. Energy generation is less, and everything goes slow. So this is one of the big problems of people who have an underactive thyroid. And I think the thyroid gland is the accelerator pedal of our car. And if that is going slow and they're running cold, then everything's going to go even slower. Mitochondria are going to slow down. And so, of course, they're going to have physical fatigue. Of course, they're going to have mental fatigue. This is why athletes warm up before they compete, because by warming up, you improve EZ water and reduce the biochemical friction in the body and the mechanical friction. So, for example, at the London Olympics, which is 2012, the cyclists had worked this out, and the velodrome was kept at 29 degrees centigrade, and which is the perfect temperature for top performance in cyclists. These are the sprinters, not the long distance riders. And more Olympic records were broken at the London Olympics than any previous Olympics. And I'm sure part of that was because the velodrome was so warm, and that was an ideal temperature for athletes to perform at their best.
Okay, pivoting off slightly, the easy water, is there any connection there to hydration and water we're drinking?
Well, yes, of course. You've got to have the right amount of water, and if you're water deprived, then you're not going to have the water there to make exclusion zone water. But I would just bear in mind that some people think it's a good thing to drink lots of water, and that can be equally harmful. In fact, some of my worst nourished patients are people who think it's a good idea to drink 3 or 4 litres of water a day. Now, you can drink pure water, but you can't pee pure water. When you pee, you always pass out all the minerals, a certain amount of them, because we don't scavenge all our minerals. So effectively, you're washing out minerals. So I like people to drink to thirst. So if you're thirsty, drink, but don't drink too much. Yes, we need fat for good quality membranes. And of course, water is retained in the body by salt. So we need lots of minerals. So it's getting the balance of those 3 things that is so important. And in parallel with that, then we need some adrenals that work fairly well, because the adrenals control salt retention in the bloodstream. And in fact, now, this sounds very counterintuitive, but I have some people who seem to suffer very much. They say they're dehydrated all the time. They're drinking all the time in order to keep hydrated. I've had 1 or 2 successes of people who do short windows of dry fasting. So maybe, I like to time restrict food. So I eat all my food within a 6-hour window. So I have 18 hours where I'm not consuming anything. And every so often, I just don't have any water either. 18 hours with no water. And it just stresses the kidneys a little bit and just wakes them up, makes them a little bit less idle. And I've had 1 or 2 notable success of people who say, well, I have to drink all the time to stay hydrated and be well. But dry fasting can sometimes be very helpful. I mean, when you look at the dry fast, there's some who dry fast up to 5 days. I wouldn't recommend that. That just seems a bit too long for my liking. You'd want to monitor that very carefully. But, it is possible. And that's another area that I'm going to be exploring in the future.
When it comes to hydration and drinking water, there's filtration, adding minerals directly to the water, structuring the water, which is a little bit different than the structured water in the body. How do you look at those variables with the water you're drinking?
Well, obviously, we want to drink the cleanest water we possibly can. Tap water in this country is just undrinkable. And so I recommend people use a water filter. Something like a Berkey water filter seems to be very popular, and that pulls out the heavy metals and many of the pesticides. If you have any concerns, or if you have fluoride in your water, then the only way to get rid of that is reverse osmosis. I have to say I haven't explored, And yes, minerals are important. I actually make up a product called Sunshine Salt, which has got all the minerals, all permitted minerals, and I suggest people add that to their food. Many people don't like that salty water. I have to say I haven't explored, the business. I know there are some people who like to use hydrogen water and activate their water in some ways, but I haven't explored that. What I can say, which is interesting, is I have horses and I have pigs here. And I'm very lucky. I have my own spring at the back, so there's a stream that runs constantly through their pen. There's a water trough which they never drink from, but from that fresh running spring water, they'll go out in the freezing cold when it's raining and drink that water because it's obviously preferable to them. Again, when I was competing my horses, I'd be 3 hours in a trailer, a competition. They would never drink the water at the foreign place, and they would come home and then they would drink. So, and animals are much more sensitive to the quality of waters than us humans. So, this is something I need to explore a bit more.
So you've never tested this water or consumed it yourself?
Oh yeah, I drink it all the time. And
okay.
No, I've never tested it. I've survived the last 35 years drinking it, so I'm sure I'll survive a bit longer.
Let's come back to meat fiber. When you brought that up, you quickly mentioned collagen. I want to make sure I understand what parts of the meat contain this fiber and if there's different types. And then you mentioned that it can actually feed the microbes. Talk about that a little bit more.
Okay, the answer is the cheapest cuts of meat you can possibly get. So, pure steak is very delicious, but it's not full of sinew and fiber and membrane and collagen. And, when you eat your chicken, you should gnaw off the collagen bits on the end of the bones. And then when you've eaten your joint, put all the bones into a stock pot and boil it and take the meat broth from that. So, when you eat a beast, you shouldn't waste any of it. I can remember, where did I read? Oh, that's right. The Special Air Service advising how to survive in the Arctic, and if you kill a seal, the first thing you should do is drill a hole in its head and suck out the brains, the warm brains. It's the most nutritious part of the animal. Again, the joy of boiling up bones is all that goodness that's in the bone marrow you can then draw out. So what should come out of the stock pot is a bone that looks like it's been in the Gobi Desert for the last few years. So nothing should be wasted, and there's nothing on an animal that you can't eat. I'm very lucky. I keep my own pigs, and they say of the pig, the only bit you can't eat is the squeak. Nothing should be wasted. Now, I have to say the lungs aren't very tasty, so I'm afraid I don't eat those. But testicles, liver, kidneys, heart, brain, absolutely delicious. And again, it probably doesn't sound very nice, but the way I cook a pig's head is I put the whole pig's head in the oven, cook it, for maybe 4 or 6 hours, and then take it out and piggle off the meat, and then the skin just lifts off, and then I boil that. Now, I think in America where your pork comes ready skinned, but in this country pork always comes with the skin on, and the skin is the most nutritious part, or very nutritious part. So what I do is I skin my pork, and then the skin I boil up in a pot for maybe 4 or 6 hours until it's friable, it's soft, it's gelatinous, and then I put that skin onto a baking tray with some salt, roast it in the oven, and it makes the most perfect pork scratchings. They are totally irresistible. With salt on them, they're tender, they're crispy, and of course they're full of meat fiber, which is ideal for the microbiome, and they're also full of sulfur, which is great for exclusion zone water. So don't waste anything. And actually, fish skins, when people have smoked fish or smoked mackerel or ordinary fish, often they just throw the skin away. But that's the most nutritious bit. And it's perfectly delicious. It might be a bit tough, but guess what? That's why we have teeth. But fish skin is very rich in collagen and meat fiber. And again, very good for the microbiome. And of course, our own connective tissue. With age, yes, we are prone to degenerate because everything slows down a little bit. So we have to look after our bodies by providing them with as much raw material as is possible. And, collagen and meat fiber and fish skins and pork skins are all a vital part of that.
One of the areas that ties closely to insulin resistance or metabolic dysfunction is weight gain. And this is one of the symptoms when we start to become metabolically unhealthy. Other than what we've been talking about today to regain metabolic health, somebody who's been struggling to lose weight, they have a lot of extra fat on their body. We talked about visceral fat, so this could be visceral or subcutaneous. Any additional recommendations for somebody that has weight to lose?
Yeah, always think thyroid. Because to access our fat in order so we can mobilize that fat and move it to the liver where it can be converted into ketones, we need thyroid hormones. So if you haven't got the thyroid hormones to mobilize fat, then we mobilize fat with adrenaline instead. And adrenaline is very uncomfortable. That's what makes you feel wired but tired. So it is a feature of people who have an underactive thyroid. They tend to gain weight. And conversely, somebody who has an overactive thyroid, they're mobilizing so much fat that the weight just drops off them. So if somebody's really stuck, then again, think thyroid. And the important point to remember is that blood tests alone are never definitive. What blood tests do is they tell us if there's biochemical scope for a trial of thyroid hormones. Because population reference ranges are very different from our individual reference range. Fascinating paper in The Lancet published some years ago that took normal people and just measured the level of T4 and T3 in their bloodstream every month for 6 months. And what they demonstrate is that we all have our own personal reference range for a free T4 and a free T3. So although the population range may be 12 to 22 picomoles per litre, some people function best at 20 to 22, some people are running at 14 to 16, some may be running at 11 to 13. And we don't know what our own personal reference range is because nobody gets tested as a teenager to see what it is. So if the blood test shows that your free T4 or your free T3 is right at low end of range, that tells us that there is biochemical scope for a trial of thyroid hormones. And for this, I use a food-grade thyroid glandulars, which you can get online. You don't have to have a prescription for these. Start with a very low dose and build up. And in parallel with that, look out, have you got any other symptoms of underactive thyroid? The classic one is your pulse running slow. We should all know how to measure our pulse, and the pulse at rest should lie between about 70 and 75 beats per minute. The athletes are a bit slower, but that's average. So if your pulse is consistently slow, your core temperature is low, and you're fatigued, your brain isn't as sharp as it should be, you've got edema, maybe a slightly swollen face, voice changes, carpal tunnel syndrome, poor quality hair, loss of eyebrows. These are all symptoms that you might have an underactive thyroid. And very often by getting the thyroid up to speed, then suddenly that kick starts, you can start to lose weight because you are able to fat burn. And the other thing that often helps is sometimes you have to do a slightly longer fast, maybe a 36-hour or a 48-hour fast. And that really kickstarts the metabolism of the body. And suddenly the body wakes up, like crumbs, we've got to get into fat burning mode, otherwise we're just not going to survive. So those are the two very useful tips that can often, kickstart the whole business of weight loss, if that is indeed a problem. But remember, upper fermenting gut, because that puts us in weight laying down mode. And again, any amount of fructose will stop you burning glycogen and is just switches off the whole business of being in ketosis.
You don't fear fat. You're all about eating the whole animal. But when it comes to weight loss specifically, how do you feel about people including extra fat? Say the butter on the steak, or putting butter in the coffee. Oftentimes in the keto carnivore world, those things are promoted to get extra good quality fat. But how do you look at that in general? And then for somebody trying to lose weight?
Okay, well, a very useful tool is MCT oil, medium chain triglycerides, because even if you're not particularly fat adapted and running on ketones, they require no digestion. They're absorbed, as MCT oil. They go straight to the liver and generate ketones. So if you're feeling, you need that little hit of energy, or you're feeling hungry and you haven't got, the brain's not working, then MCT oil would be a perfect solution, because it's not going to go to fat. It goes straight to ketones, which you then burn off. And those ketones will stimulate mitochondria to go faster. And they also stimulate the growth of more mitochondria. And as you know, I think of mitochondria as the engines of our car. So it gives you a bigger engine that then goes faster. It's a bit expensive. That's the only trouble. But MCT oil is a very useful trick to help if you're trying to lose weight and maintain energy levels.
For somebody who's tuned into this point, they're in that category of metabolic dysfunction. They have some extra weight to lose, but they're inspired and they're going to take action. For somebody that's going to adopt a lot of what we talked about today, what do you recommend? Jumping in cold turkey and just doing everything, or doing it at a slower pace and letting their body adjust?
It depends how ill you are. I see people with fatigue syndromes, and some of them are very ill, because when you put in place these interventions, you get detox reactions, you get ketogenic hypoglycemia, you get keto flu. Sometimes if you're allergic to food, you can get allergy and addiction are two sides of the same coin. You can get withdrawal symptoms. So if you're otherwise completely well, and I'd use just jump in and do it. But if you are sick, I think you have to do it more slowly. And the other point here is if people have been running on carbohydrates for all their life, and the vast majority of people have, then they will often struggle with a high-fat diet. And the reason for that is that the business of digesting fat is enormously demanding of energy. The pancreas has to produce a lot of enzymes, and the business of generating enzymes requires a lot of energy. And so if that person has been running on carbohydrates for forever and a day, then they're just not going to be able to produce the enzymes to digest that fat. So sometimes you just have to go into it slowly and maybe take extra pancreatic enzymes and maybe take some bile salts to help emulsify the fat in order to facilitate, fat, that you can tolerate that fat. But so the answer is it depends. And the sicker you are, the slower you go.
For somebody that is very enthusiastic, they jump in, they're very committed, how quickly can they turn this around?
Oh, very quickly. In a few days or weeks. As soon as you get into ketosis, everything just starts to fall into place. Your blood levels level out, you stop spiking insulin and adrenaline, the brain settles down, your quality of sleep improves, the fermenting guts, if you've got any gut symptoms, they disappear. And it's the start, if you've got any condition associated with inflammation, and I think much inflammation is driven by allergy to microbes in the upper fermenting gut, then the inflammatory markers settle down. And in parallel with this, put in place the detox regimes, because we're all poisoned, MSM, and maybe metal chelation therapy. I'm increasingly coming to the view that we all have to do it all. Now, when I started work as a GP in the early 1980s, it was relatively easy to get people well with a simple elimination diets and a few supplements. Nowadays, it's much more difficult. It's much more difficult because most people are carbohydrate addicts. We're all poisoned. Underactive thyroids and poor adrenal functions and poor mitochondrial functions are very common. So, we just all have to do it all. And it always starts with diet and sorting out the upper fermenting gut and taking a basic package of nutritional supplements and then playing it by ear from there on. If you've got nasty pathology like cancer, then we haven't got time to muck about. You just have to dive in, and do the keto diet ASAP, because you can't afford to waste time whilst the cancer grows. As you know, the difference between cancer cells and normal cells is cancer cells can only run on sugars and carbs, whereas our immune system, which is what we need to fight cancer, that can run very happily on fats. So it very much depends on the pathology, but these interventions really are the starting point to treat absolutely everything.
For somebody that wants to throw everything at this, How do you feel about some of these newer tools that are popular in the health world right now, like methylene blue, creatine, anything else in that realm that has a lot of momentum that people can stack on?
Well, creatine is very good for muscles. And again, keeping strong is very important. So yes, I'm very happy for people to take creatine. And for many, it helps energy delivery mechanisms. Methylene blue, I wouldn't do that straight away. Yes, it's a very safe intervention. It's good for energy delivery mechanisms, and it has good antimicrobial activity. So for some people, that is very helpful too. But people are always looking for the quick fix. And they come to me and they want me to say, you take this herb or you take that methylene blue, or you do this and you'll be fine. It's not like that. It's hard work. And, we're talking the talk, but that poor person then has to go away and walk the walk and actually do it. So I try to concentrate on what I call the bleeding obvious. And, we must all do the basics. And for the vast majority of people, all this basic stuff done really well gets you an awful long way. But better than that, as I call it, it clarifies those muddy clinical waters. Because people come to me with shopping lists of symptoms. And sometimes I don't know if this is going to cause that or if that's going to cause the other. But when you put in place all these interventions, then cause and effect becomes much more obvious. And then people then become their own doctors. They become their own detectives, because being a doctor should be like a detective. Then we get the symptoms, which are our clues, and then we put in place various interventions and see if those symptoms improve. If they don't improve, we've got the diagnosis wrong. We have to go back to base. But doctors don't think like this. They don't think causation. And so what it's important to do is we all have to become our own doctor. We all have to be interested in self, and nobody's going to be better motivated and nobody's going to be in a better position to do it than self. Because there's only one person that puts food in your mouth. There's only one person that does your shopping and your cooking. And there's only one person that observes those symptoms. And after 4.5 decades of going up every blind alley possible, I'm now descending on the bleeding obvious, and we all need to do that, and that will get the majority of people an awful long way.
Well, I think in conversations like this, we have to be careful along the lines of what you're saying, not to make it too costly if we don't have to, and not to make it too complicated, because people are just going to turn an eye and not get started. So let's take it the other way as our final question here. The opposite of bringing in things like methylene blue and creatine. What is the simplest formula for people? We've shared a lot here over the last 90 minutes. I'm sure ketogenic diet is going to be the foundation, but what is the simplest protocol somebody can adopt today to get that momentum?
Well, ketogenic diet, and then take vitamin C and iodine to sort out the upper fermenting gut, because that is so common. And if you've got an upper fermenting gut, then you will malabsorb nutritional supplements. So ketogenic diet, iodine and vitamin C to sort out the upper fermenting gut. Then we all need a basic package of nutritional supplements, which is a multivitamin, a good multimineral, vitamin D, 10,000 IU a day, vitamin C, 5 grams a day, iodine, Lugol's iodine, 3 drops, which you already started on. And then time restrict eat. Consume all your food within a 6-hour window of time. And if you've got the energy in parallel with that, we all need to be strong. We all need to do some exercise, which benefits in so many ways. And you don't have to be a jogger, just simple isometric exercises that should become part of our daily routine. And all that done really well is going to get the vast majority of people a long way. Keep it simple. Oh, a big pardon. And we should all be doing detox regimes. Think heavy metals and MSM for the heavy metals, and then some sort of heating regime. So if you're a runner, then just going for a little jog and showering off afterwards, fantastic. If you're not a runner, Epsom salt baths, fantastic. And we can all do that. So these are all things that can be incorporated into our everyday life. They're the most frictionless interventions I can think of, and all affordable, all intrinsically safe. The potential for harm is effectively zero, and just essential for us all to do.
All right, Sarah, really enjoyed the conversation. Always do. We're going to leave it there for today. We're going to link up your website, your books, your social media. Thank you.
Jesse, thank you very much. And thank you for your time too.
Now that you're done, you're going to want to stick around here and catch this other incredible episode. You don't want to miss it. I'll see you over there.
The reason my program is so different is because I target insulin. Most people today are overproducing insulin. They're eating foods that are triggering a high insulin response, and they're loaded with insulin. Insulin is the master fat.